Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to our third paper, and I'm sure you've all been waiting for this one, because not only is the subject very important, but we've got a very special guest, namely Robert Clink. He's come all the way from Canada, and firstly, a great welcome to you to come to Australia. Good on you, Robert. Now, Bill Daly is a name known to many of you. He's a New Zealander, and he tells me that the well-known social creditors in Wales, Geoffrey and Elizabeth Dobbs, at one stage said there's two people in the world that are great proponents of social credit, and they are Wally and Robert Clink. So we'll say we've got the best one here today, won't we?
That's not on record.
So, no, honestly, we are privileged that Robert has seen himself able to come across to Australia. He's going to have a brief speaking tour in Tasmania, Victoria, and then he's going up to join with Chas. Just read the last paper. He's going to spend some time up there with Chas, and Will Waite will no doubt be rubbing shoulders with him too. Robert was born and raised in Alberta in Western Canada. He's one of a family of 5 boys. At university he achieved a BA in maths and an MA in history. So we might be struggling a bit here. His father was a student under William Aberhart, who later became the social credit premier of the province. That was the Alberta province, wasn't it? Yes, yes. So those who, I'm sure that this audience is well aware of Aberhart and the social credit party movement over there. Robert has worked with the social credit party in Canada, primarily in the field of research. He's given many talks on social credit at venues including schools and universities. You're pretty brave taking it to the universities, probably. His hobbies include woodwork, badminton and sailing. He married a French-Canadian girl and they produced 2 sons, Matthew and David. I would have thought the Canadian girls would like, French girls would like the French man, but no, you've won him over. Yeah. So, to talk on the cultural inheritance of social credit, please welcome Robert Clink.
Here to talk about that man. I don't think anyone else has mentioned him yet. Major C.H. Douglas, who's the founder of social credit. Besides having an astonishingly comprehensive mind, the founder of social credit, Major C.H. Douglas, had 2 other strong character traits. He was active and he was adaptable. Thus, in his lifetime, he laid the foundation for society's transition into a new era in civilization. His contribution is astonishing. When I say he was adaptable, I'm not suggesting that he was fluid as to his fundamental goals, for he had a clear and consistent philosophy as regards the framework of the universe and the position of mankind in it. His adaptability came into play with regard to the tactics he evolved over many years in order to advance his practical goals. When during World War I he chanced upon his momentous discovery of an inherent flaw in the price system, in the financial accountancy system, which places mankind on a treadmill of compulsive production dissociated from the true needs and aspirations of the individuals constituting society, he applied himself to rigorously confirming and analyzing this defect he had happened upon, incorporating his knowledge into our cultural heritage eventually. Social credit talked a lot about the cultural heritage, but social credit is a component of the cultural heritage, and a very important one. Once he was certain that he had critical information to convey to those who should have been best positioned to remedy the problem he had found, he set about getting the message to them. He met many of the great and good of his time, great and good by reputation in many settings and in a variety of countries, from kings to prime ministers to great economists, allegedly. And for example, he came to Canada in 1923 at the invitation of the editor of one of the two principal newspapers in Ottawa, a very important newspaper and institution. And he gave extensive evidence before the Finance Committee of the Federal Parliament at that time. Interestingly, his travel expenses were covered by the Southam family, which was one of the wealthiest families in Canada, and they were involved in the publication business. The curiosity about this neophyte, Douglas, on the international stage, not that Douglas was interested in the least in his personal status as an economic authority, faded as the implication of his proposals became clear to many wealthy and influential people who initially paid a lot of attention to it. For he proposed to turn the immense productive capacity issuing from the Industrial Revolution to the purpose of freeing, to the maximum extent possible, individuals from the control of others. Those in positions of control, as a rule, didn't see much advantage to them in such a change, and they shortly abandoned any interest they had in social credit because their pretenses as philanthropists, which they often adopted, when Douglas tested the depth of their philanthropy, was found wanting. They set themselves against getting the benefits of the cultural heritage over to the population as a whole. This was the potential that Douglas had seen and that he promoted throughout his career. The problem was the one that has plagued us ever since we were first given God's message through Christ. An act of hostility toward Douglas became manifest. Political and economic debate was acceptable to the powers that be within the parameters only that they established. Douglas was outside that box. He was introducing considerations that no one else had, basically. And the concepts he was promoting just didn't fit well within the established orthodoxy. As Sidney Webb, the influential Fabian socialist, said, he didn't care if Douglas's technical analysis was right or not. He objected to its purposes. He didn't want people to be set free. He was a man who was full of pride, believed that he should be planning for society as a whole, and others would just respond to his initiatives. He didn't want to be stripped of his own possibilities of enjoying power and status. The opposition to Douglas mobilized to stop the spread of his dangerous ideas. They were not dangerous to the ordinary citizen, but they were regarded as dangerous to the privileged position that the establishment enjoyed. He proposed that everyone should receive regular dividends in financial form to supplement their income. And he said not only was this feasible because of the enormous productive potential of a modern economy, but it was also necessary if the economy was to be kept viable and free in a never-intensifying competition for economic advantage among countries that would always inevitably eventuate in war. These dividends would represent everyone's share in the material fruits of our cultural heritage. Mention of social credit soon was forbidden in major commercial publications, or if it did happen to be mentioned, its precepts were invariably misrepresented. They could not go onto the ground that Douglas was discussing because it was too revelatory of the reality that we were living in. Douglas admitted that he had been somewhat, though not completely by any means, naive in assuming that there would be a more receptive response to his discovery of this flaw in the price system and proposals than there turned out to be. He had anticipated opposition, but clearly there was a powerful political obstacle that would have to be overcome before his economic reforms could be achieved. He adjusted his emphasis by attention to this new discovery, well, not particularly new, he had adverted to it, but he didn't realize the depth of it, and directed an unprecedented campaign that the Australian League of Rights has allowed us to study by posting the years of publication of the journals Social Credit and the Social Creditor, a campaign of popular pressure on political institutions in Britain, which had counterparts in many English-speaking countries and also French-speaking Quebec in Canada. While great strides toward making institutions responsive to public pressure were made by Douglas and his group, Douglas concluded from these efforts, in his own words, that society is hypnotized and only a drastic dehypnotization can save it. Thus, he stressed a third layer to the challenge that social creditors faced in achieving their reform goals, a psychological problem. The powers that be that opposed social credit really had nothing to fear as long as the general population remained in a state that was more than passive, more than ignorant, actually somnolent, because of the occupation of their minds with numbing input from the media and entertainment industries. This remains a major challenge for social creditors, and in fact is much greater today than it was in Douglas's time. In the midst of all this, social credit remains a totally censored topic. And as George Orwell said, omission is the most powerful form of a lie. This is the big establishment media lie about social credit, their refusal to admit it even to consideration. Now, language has been seriously under attack. This has been in an endeavor to paralyze the capacity to think. But there is one useful term that has developed and become quite commonplace in recent times, and that is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the juxtaposition of two concepts that must be reconciled to each other logically, but are intended to be mentally assimilated at the same time. It places the mind in a position of conflict because it can't logically connect the two ideas that are being presented to it. This is very damaging to the subconscious mind that doesn't have a wary protector, a conscious mind that is looking for this cognitive dissonance all the time. It is ubiquitous in our society. I think once you get the notion that it's being used against you, you read practically any newspaper article, you look at any film, and you'll find within them conflicting ideas that just can't be reconciled. I was on the plane. I happened to look at a child's cartoon film. It was presenting a little fish that had no memory. But in the middle of the film, all of a sudden this fish is giving lectures on the heart construction of an octopus. So how probably 90% of the little children in the world are going to see this. How do their minds take this in? I mean, it's an attack on their ability to reason. This cognitive dissonance creates a kind of miasma to our perception of reality, and reality encompasses our cultural heritage. Douglas drew attention to many examples of this, what he didn't know it as cognitive dissonance. He knew it as, I guess, irony. And the most flagrant probably being the coexistence of an economy in which you have engineers striving to use their brains to develop more efficient systems of productivity, thereby diminishing the human component of that productivity, putting people out of work, while you had, at the same time, politicians insisting on a thing called full employment. You know, they're conflicting goals, irreconcilable. Anyway, I would say also that an event like 9/11, because of the evident misrepresentation of what happened there, constitutes a form of cognitive dissonance. how could a building that had a small fire in it, hasn't been damaged in any other way, had no airplane fly into it, suddenly collapse in 6 seconds into its footstep, you know? And yet you're expected to believe that the only aspect of that day was the attack by 19 hijackers on airplanes. Looking at that, I've wondered, you know, Douglas was a trained engineer. He worked all over the world. He worked in Brazil, Canada, India, on major projects. And I always thought, what if he were living today, he would have made of 9/11. You know, he would have been able to analyze it. And nobody else has analyzed it because there was no follow-up investigation, you know. They should still be studying the ruins of that thing in order to find out the process by which it collapsed in order to, avoid a repetition in future. Anyway, I have another good example of cognitive dissonance here, and it comes from our illustrious governor of the Bank of Canada. He said in an article in April of this year, the Canadian economy has some slack, but not very much. By the Bank of Canada's estimate, the Canadian economy is estimating somewhere between 98.3 and 99.4% of full capacity. I don't know any individual who's working to full capacity. I look at the land in Canada, and 50% of it is in fallow. It's it's the most ridiculous statement you could possibly imagine, and you wonder what in the world he is talking about. But so it is, and somehow we're supposed to take his words and reconcile it with what we see about us. The robotic revolution of production can no longer be ignored, and in fact is being admitted by many publications today. And the public eventually will become so conscious of this that the politicians are going to have to deal with it and stop talking about full employment policies when institutions like the Oxford University are predicting that within 10 to 20 years, 50% of existing jobs will be eliminated by technology. And they're talking about jobs in practically every field. In construction, even now, the Chinese are 3D printing houses. They have a gigantic machine, and it shoots a sort of plasticized material, and it builds a house. And they built 20 houses in one day with this technique a year ago. So eventually, this is all going to come to, other countries, and these construction jobs will be eliminated, good-paying jobs, generally speaking. Transport will be done by self-driven vehicles. That's going to eliminate trucking. Good jobs. In the United States, there are 3.4 million people who derive their income from driving vehicles. Before long, newspaper articles will be written by robots. You wonder if they're not already being written by robots sometimes because they're so preposterous and so repetitive and so untrue. And the second factor that allow us to overcome this multiple layer of challenges we face in realizing social credit reforms, the limits of sanity are being pushed so far in society that people are going to fight back at some point, particularly now with the children being under attack with this sexual education program, which is everywhere. How can it be that simultaneously throughout the whole Western world you have the same push for this program? It has to be a conspiracy. There's no other way to look at it. There will be a strong reaction at some point as people respond to pushing of the limits of sanity. They are sort of driven to do this because they don't have a concept that there is order in the universe and that there is some sort of structure that they have to respect. They must insist that man has total control of his destiny and future, and therefore they make more and more radical proposals for change in society, particularly now this sexual revolution, and also, I suppose, sort of robotization of humans, the implantation of machines into humans and that sort of thing. People are not going to accept that, generally speaking. This is going to lead, I think, to a series of crises. People are going to react. This is because, in fact, every crisis, as disturbing as it may be, is also an opportunity. Assistant of Barack Obama, Rahm Emanuel, said, in politics, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we should have the same attitude. We should never let a good crisis go to waste, because it affords an opportunity to fight back against this program of constant concentration of power. As consciousness grows, cognitive dissonance will be exposed. The politicians will have the public anger. They won't be able to deflect. And I'm certain that there are many young people who are decent and intelligent. They will see the difference between their potential for a good life and their prospects for life, which is enormous. And they will revolt in some form, probably through the internet. The important thing is that we should be on the spot and speaking of social credit so that they won't be siphoned off into the socialist communist movement, which is directed toward them all the time. I have here some interesting statistics on the robotization of economies. China went from having 32,000 industrial robots in 2008 to 189,000 by 2014. They're projected to have 519,000 within another 2 years. So this conversion of the productive system to robotic assembly lines is proceeding apace. And it's interesting that they project here what it's going to be in a few years' time. I wonder how anybody could possibly know that, because if they put a drive on to introduce more robots, then there will be not more. If they decide they're going to be Luddites and not allow the development of this machinery because it's affecting people's prospects for employment, then there will be fewer. They're going to be facing a crisis because people are being displaced from the productive system, and the only way that they can be afforded a means of survival is to give them some other work, and the participation in the productive system is going down like this. Participation in government bureaucracies is going up. 10 years before 1989, there were about 10 million more industrial production jobs in the United States than government jobs. In 1989, those 2 points met, and there were approximately the same number in both. And now there are 10 million more government jobs than there are jobs in production. And the jobs in production were at their high point, 19 million. They're now down around 12 million. It's a revolutionary change. Given this special opportunity to speak to you here, I thought that I might deal with what I think is the most basic understanding of social credit. At its most fundamental level, what is social credit about? I'd say the answer can be found in the words of Jesus, who said, "The sole reason for our existence together is that we should love each other." What does this mean? Well, he gave us a key to what it means, because he said we are to love each other as we love ourselves. And this calls upon us to think about what it means to love ourselves. It obviously has nothing to do with egotism or narcissism, because these traits drive people apart. I submit that every person can have a sense of his essence with which he feels perfectly harmonized and at ease. I don't think everybody is in that position, but you do meet people who seem to be, and they're marvelous individuals. Some blessed persons go through their lives in touch with this sense. Others lose it, various reasons, mostly environmental, I suppose, but some find it again after a period of separation. I suppose this is what T.S. Eliot meant. In our lives, we quest for answers and go through our lives doing so, at the end of our quest, we find that we've been brought back to our point of departure, hopefully now with more understanding than we started out with. This sense of ourselves with which we have heart's ease is not something we can improve upon. It's not something that we exercise in order to make ourselves better. It is instilled in us. It is a gift we receive at birth from God, and therefore, being from God is perfect in itself. You can't improve upon it. Good parents recognize it in their children as unique personality and will do their utmost to protect it from harm. And just as there is in the world not one nose identical to any other, there is no soul identical to any other. Every soul is unique. Social credit recognizes this fact. And loving yourself is nothing but being responsive in a true way to the guidance of this unique motor inside us that is implanted in us at our very core, our soul. And loving others means nothing less than encouraging them to be so guided as well. The whole purpose of our earthly life is to favor the emergence of true souls in interaction with each other. For this interaction to be authentic, the parties to it must have autonomy, the autonomy that we call personal freedom. In the loving order of things, the only impetus that has worth comes from within, in the eyes of God, and whatever we do under external compulsion is meaningless and null in his perception. As Major Douglas said, so long as you can keep the problem of making living central to a people's lives, you have a perfect means of maintaining control over them. This is the system that's been implemented. And it is probably the most genius system for control without brutal compulsion ever developed. Social credit aims at releasing people from this control to the extent that our real resources, which thanks to our cultural heritage are vast, practically unimaginable today, make possible. It doesn't mean the end of economics, but escape from the tyranny of economics. It doesn't mean the end of economics because actually economics provides a wonderful field for the exercise of the creative human spirit. This means a decisive advance toward the achievement, or maybe, if some historians who argue that things weren't so bad in the past after all, and actually might have been an improvement of what we're living today, if they're right about the real conditions in which our ancestors lived, perhaps this will be a reclamation of our Christian society.
Robert, there's a sleeping giant in the process that we've been looking at this afternoon, and I'm referring to our Christian churches. At
Sleeping indeed.
Level, a sleeping giant. At what level is the Christian church being infiltrated and compromised as it is enmeshed in end-time theology and not impressed with the cultural heritage that you've been telling us about and is espoused by Christ? I think you'll find in the parable of the fig tree and other areas too.
Yeah. Certainly, I'm aware that the Communist Party in the United States back in the 1930s had a program of penetrating Christian churches in order to subvert them. I don't know to what extent that was carried out. I don't know how successful it was, but the Christian churches, generally speaking, are pretty pallid and ineffectual organizations today. And as far as I can see, I don't go to church that regularly, but I go sometimes, and there are many passages from Christ's words that you will never hear uttered in a Christian church.
Recently I've come across a group called the British Constitution Group.
Yes, they're affiliated.
The Real Bank, where I think they talk about putting $100 or pounds, or £100 would be, into their real, what's money we carry, and they'll give you £1,000 credit within their system. Have you heard very much about it, or any comments?
Well, as far as I know, that group is affiliated with the UK Column organization in Britain, and they promote the reinstitution of what they call the Bradbury Pound, which was a issue of government money at the time of the abandonment of the gold standard in Britain. Or maybe it was, I think it might have been the reinstitution of the gold standard, because there wasn't enough gold around to meet the claims that were being made against it, you know. And it's fairly influential in Britain, but I think that putting, without some sort of condition or some kind of constitutional regulation even, power to create money in the hands of the state wouldn't put us in a better position than we're in now. Do we have confidence in our politicians? I think we probably have less confidence in our politicians than we have in our bankers, at least our local bankers, you know. So it's an idea that I wish that they would refine, and they would push the concept that supplementary income, fresh income, should be being flowed not through powerful institutions, but being sent directly to the population as an equal universal dividend. The population will spend that money, stimulate the economy, and the benefits would be great.
Robert, I see social credit as a wonderful means of sharing the wealth, like our productive capacity. But there's something that sort of got me puzzled. I hear lately about the CEO of one of our corporations, either, I'm not sure whether it's Australia Post or Telecom or one of those, on about $4.5 million a year as a salary.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's obscene, and I don't mean to be dictatorial, but could we get, is there a means to get this back into some sort of sensibility? This is just madness.
Well, if you give the population more power in the form of purchasing power, there's going to be a huge impact on the political system. And scandals like that would just not be tolerated by the population.
Robert, I just recently came across in the New Times on our website, July 1979, so bear that in mind. And I read an article by a fellow called Clink. You may have heard of him.
Yeah, I think I met him a few times.
Now, I think that was a most important article. You know why? Let me go back a little bit in my history, and that is at one stage talking with Eric Butler. And I was saying to him, Eric, look at the world situation. What are we going to, it's terrible. The other side is winning. And he would give his wry smile, and he said to me words to the effect, they won't win, you know. How can you say that, Eric? Look at what's happening. They won't. Why won't they win? Because they go against the very fabric of the universe. Mm-hmm. Now, I understood that side of it, being the wife of a carpenter, and you go with the grain and all of that. But it was in reading Dennis Klink's article just recently, and he was able to tie together for me what the canon was that Douglas speaks of. Mm-hmm. And another particular book that is important for me is the Dorothy Sayers one on Creed or Chaos.
Yes, she was an amazing writer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you have to tie these things together. You won't hear it in the church. You won't hear about the Christ in the church. You will hear about Jesus, the man, the historical man. But you'll never understand who or what is the Christ. And that to me is the important part about what Eric said. He understood it. And in that time they did, ones like Douglas or Butler did speak about it, but they didn't take it on because that was the church's role. And the church
failed.
Didn't do it.
Yes.
Would you like to comment on that?
Well, Douglas had as his underlying belief the conviction that there was order running through the warp and woof of the universe, and that man's function was to endeavor to discover it, and to the extent he discovered it, put the principles he discovered into application. And he felt that these principles applied in human society, all kinds of associations. They applied in the physical world, chemistry, physics, engineering, anything. They applied probably even in the invisible world, you know, all things visible and invisible. And so he thought that our responsibility in life was to understand these things and to apply them. I saw another fellow recently, a very bright Catholic man, and he was saying that the problem with the modern world is that nobody understands the logos. And I think the logos is essentially the same as the canon.
That's right.
And he said, if the population of the world understood the logos, the conflict would just dissolve, because they would understand how they're supposed to be relating to each other, the purpose of life. So, again, you were very right. The churches just don't talk about these matters.
Never heard
They-
it. I've never
yeah.
heard it spoken. I've been going to church all my adult
Yeah,
life.
yeah.
Guy's got one.
I think at one time that was a basic understanding within, not only within the church, but even within the general population.
That's
You know, that going back to medieval times, possibly.
Probably during the course of your address, you made reference to the robotization of industry and some of the outcomes that may eventuate from it. You also made a very brief reference to Luddites. I believe
Oh,
I
yes.
heard you say that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I read a fair bit about that when I was younger, and they made extensive efforts. Those farm people, really, you know, country people, to destroy various industrial complexes or
Yeah. Machinery.
machinery.
Threw them out of work, yes.
In those days, people who did that, were they caught, either got their necks stretched, or they ended up in this country. Don't look at me, I'm not one of them, but, or do I have any descendants? But I'm saying that this is what happened. In those days, it was done by soldiers. And there was only a small amount of soldiers, but they succeeded. We live in a country, Western countries, that's literally infested with police. I can't see any outcome for protest against robotization.
Well, it's the same in Canada. Seems to be a police car on every street corner. I have visited China. You can't find a policeman. Now, everything is being filmed constantly. And my son actually has a driver's license in China, very rare for a foreigner to get. And it's a very dangerous thing to do, too, because they're absolutely insane drivers. But anyway, he says that at the end of the month, you get a letter with a bill for the infractions that have been filmed. He says usually they're small amounts, but it's a pretty regular thing. So you have surveillance, but you don't have police. And that, in a way, that's a disadvantage, because it's good to have a policeman if something untoward happens, you know, a theft or a beating or an accident. And that is much less accessible in China. They've got a pretty hard attitude toward each other, I think, just because there's so many of them, you know. Yeah.
Robert, the control that you referred to later in your talk, that's part of this divide and rule concept that's
Absolutely.
affecting us all.
Mm-hmm.
It divides our society so much that southern Queensland's not up in arms about the passing of our neighbour George. How do we get around this, and can you expound on that further?
Well, they've got us in a bind, because there's a constant competition, extreme competition for fewer and fewer jobs, and you have interest groups in society that end up competing against each other for these jobs. I know in Canada, practically every society is the same, I think. There's a minority population of French Canadians. What they do is they introduce affirmative action programs for the French Canadians. The French Canadians get the jobs. In order to get a job in the federal government, you pretty well have to be bilingual.
Yeah.
Well, 80% of the population is English, and most of them, almost all of them, are unilingual English. So their opportunities for employment with the government are vastly diminished. It's a terrible injustice. But, and the French Canadians are not unjust people, but they have to have a source of income too.
Yeah.
So they're happy about the advantage they have. They're probably not happy about what they're doing to the opportunities for other people. But that's going on in every society. They've got it in the United States with the Spanish element there, and they've got it, that. Well, in Spain, you know, the Andalusians, all these minor provinces. Even in China, the minorities were not subject to the one-child policy. I didn't know that, but they were, and that was a very strange policy because it meant eventually that the minority population would be growing relative to the majority population, you know. But it's just a policy you see being applied everywhere. And you're right, it's divide and rule. They keep a shortage of what you need in order to survive, and then people fight over it. And if they identify with some group, then you end up with groups fighting within society. Yeah, and it's the same on the international level. Countries fighting with each other over the opportunity to export their stuff, even though the real effect of exporting products to other countries is that you put it out of the range of your own population. What you should be doing is making sure that there's a strong consumer purchasing capacity with your own country, and that people can buy everything they want from what you're producing there. But now everybody's trying to make money by exporting. You know, it's a backwards point of view.
Well, the way things are going at the moment, with Mobileye driving your car for you, robots making everything for you, it's interesting that they've been talking about helicopter money.
Yeah.
Heard the expression?
Yeah, well, helicopter money was an idea that was put forward by Milton Friedman, I think. He was a big American economist. And he said, if there's not enough money, just fly over cities and drop helicopter money. Well, it's a pretty stupid proposal, isn't it? Why don't you direct the money to the population in the form of a credit in their bank account every month or something? So they make it ridiculous so people don't take it seriously. John Maynard Keynes said that we might have to, in order to allow people to purchase more, have a better consumer support for the economy, go and bury money in coal mines and send people in to dig it out. Then you can give them a salary because they've done some work, totally useless work.
Big holes, fill them up.
That's right, yeah.
So thank you for bringing your message to us today about the importance of that. And incidentally, tomorrow in the action conference, we're going to have a little exercise on that, just to sort of clarify our thinking of how that deficiency comes about. But I'd like you to put your hands together and Robert, would you please accept that?
Said that the love of money is the root of all evil. And yet, in our society today, money is a total obsession, probably the matter that people most consider in their lives. People look toward the money system as a key to improving their conditions of life, and yet it seems to be something that is receding as more and more difficult to acquire in a secure and dependable manner. The nature of money, therefore, is something that requires study. And unfortunately, people do not realize that money is actually an ephemeral phenomenon. Most people think of money as being a stock that just moves around within the population through economic activity. But money is actually cycling into and out of existence on a continuous basis. This is done through the banking system. Every loan that a bank issues is actually fresh money. It's an addition to the money supply. And every time that a loan is repaid, that money is actually canceled out of existence. It's no longer available to the community for its use. For any people who are skeptical about the description I've given of the process by which money comes into existence, a process that actually has been revealed many times over the past century, but which the banks have not made any efforts to draw to the attention of the public as general knowledge, I have here a quarterly publication from the Bank of England, probably the most authoritative financial body in the world, which reads, "Money creation in practice differs from some popular misconceptions. Banks do not simply act as intermediaries, lending out deposits that savers place with them, and nor do they multiply up central bank money to create new loans and deposits. The amount of money created in the economy ultimately depends on the monetary policy of the central bank. In normal times, this is carried out by setting interest rates. The central bank can also affect the amount of money directly through purchasing assets or quantitative easing. In the modern economy, most money takes the form of bank deposits. The principal way that bank deposits is created is through commercial banks making loans. Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money." Douglas hit upon this discovery of the failure of the credit issue and recall to correspond with the physical processes of the economy by chance toward the end of the First World War. And he put forth his famous A plus B theorem. The A plus B theorem basically said that the amount of income issuing from any corporation in a given production cycle is inferior to the value of prices accumulating that the public will have to liquidate when the process of consumption takes place. The implication of this is that the public is receiving an insufficient amount of income at all times to buy what it is actually producing. This creates tremendous strains in the economy. It means that there's a surplus of goods that have to be got rid of. It has meant in the past that sometimes these goods were deliberately destroyed rather than being made available to the public. The best example of this is probably in the Great Depression, when oceans of milk were dumped into gutters on streets and mountains of fruit and vegetables were allowed to rot while people were going hungry. This shortage of income can be illustrated fairly simply if you consider this cycling of credit in and out of existence and the generation of prices. Take, for example, a company that is building a condominium complex. In the course of doing this, they're going to have workers completing the project. These workers are going to be receiving their wages, and a large portion of these wages is going to be used to pay off mortgages, car loans, things of that nature. And as soon as those payments are made, the bank cancels that money out of existence. This is cumulative in the prices that are going to be reclaimed for this project in the end, because eventually the value of that property is going to have to be reclaimed from the public. But the money that was issued in the process of creating it will no longer be in existence. As the mortgage for the property falls due, other sources of money to meet that obligation will have to be provided. But the same flaw exists at that stage as well. The income flowing from the new project will be prematurely canceled and not available when the price has to be paid for that project as well. So the public is constantly falling behind at an accelerating rate in their ability to liquidate the costs building up in the economy. It's a fundamental flaw, and the only reason why it isn't addressed by the powers that be is that it creates a position of control by them over the population. The public is constantly on a treadmill trying to keep up with the accumulating costs, an impossible task under the rules of accountancy that we have in the economy now, and therefore they are bent to the will of the people who are controlling the creation of money. That money is continually being issued, canceled, and renewed in the form of new loans assumes a special significance when one realizes that money transactions are linked in a definite way with economic activities involving the physical transformation of materials and their distribution. Buildings are raised, tools are fabricated, equipment wears out, consumer goods are bought, and all of these phenomena have precise monetary values associated with them. Financial credit, loans, has long been an essential feature of commercial transactions and for considerable time now for consumer purchases, homes, cars, boats, etc. This has been a feature of the economy now for centuries. And logically, it makes sense that money should remain in existence in sums large enough and for periods long enough to ensure that these economic operations, once started, can be completed. From a realistic perspective, so-called recessions and depressions are merely financial phenomena, not related to our physical situation at all, and these economic downturns should be unimaginable as long as people have economic needs and producers have the physical resources and will to meet the needs. Nowadays, financial credit is being sucked back to its source and cancelled before it has brought to completion the operations that its issue has initiated. This is a grave problem and an inherent dilemma within our current financial and economic system. Why would governments urge people to amass savings against a future rainy day when rainy days are practically always the result of restrictive financial policies and therefore completely artificial? It only makes sense that the recall of bank loans should be governed by the economic processes for which the loans have been made. A system designed to maximize economic benefits for all components of a dynamic relationship must be financial transactions to their economic counterparts. And if the rules for furnishing credit do not take this properly into account, the connection between money issue and recall and the production and consumption of goods is put on a false basis. Economic strain entailing harmful social manifestations must follow. In the dance relating money to real processes, it only makes sense that the latter, the real processes, should be taking the lead. Unfortunately, the banks have arranged things in such a fashion that the lead is being provided by money. Unfortunately, chartered banks do not even attempt to ensure that the relationship between their loaning, that is their money-creating activities, and production and consumption is a true relationship. Rather, as they readily admit in their internal publications, the bank's operations are intended to maximize their own profits and leverage over the economic activities of the community as a whole. This is an antisocial position. To achieve their end, the banks consciously aim to place the community in a position of increasing dependence upon them. This explains why they extinguish at so rapid a rate the credit they manufacture, so that people are compelled to keep reapplying to them for the means of financing their ongoing economic functions. The idea is to cancel the credit as quickly as possible while leaving with the community collectively a growing obligation to the banks in the form of new debt contracted merely to meet interest charges on the old. Essentially, it's a racket. This is the policy that has led to the present burgeoning personal, corporate, and governmental debt structures we have at present, to whose extension there is no end in sight, because a trap has been laid for us, and there's no escape from it with the financial system operating as it does today. Now, money serves a social function that cannot be reconciled with its being managed by a private interest primarily to further that private interest's own advantage. Yet, you would be hard-pressed to find a politician who will go near this issue with a barge pole, as fundamental as it is. Occasionally, you might find an opposition party that is protesting high levels of bank profits, but never will they go into the area of the lack of synchronization of real economic processes with the cycle of credit issue and recall. Why politicians don't embark in this area of consideration is because any politician with career smarts knows that this area is off limits if he wants to have a continuing career in politics. Major Douglas, the founder of social credit, correlated these matters in a way that was truly an earth-moving insight. He demonstrated how the ephemeral quality of money has been worked to the banker's advantage at the cost of dislocating every other function of the economy. He also showed how credit could be issued with a durability matched to the cost recovery schedule for the things it was intended to represent. This latter policy, as he formulated it, would, however, have had the effect of shifting control over the economy out of the bankers' hands and into those of the public generally, which undoubtedly explains why it has been encouraged to die a quiet death by all whose ambition is to remain on good terms with the powers that be. By this premature cancellation of credit through the repayment of loans, the banks, of course, keep money scarce, demand for it high, and their privileged status in society secure. I have here an illustration of the money flows and price flows that I have just described in a superficial manner. This was a diagram produced by an American academic who became one of the foremost promoters of social credit in the United States back in the 1930s and 40s. His name was Gorham Munson, and he was a prominent academic. At the university where he taught, there is a library of his contributions to the academic world. The result of people being put on this treadmill of trying to have their incomes keep up with the accumulation of prices in the economy has been, to date, to produce a worldwide, a global debt of $152 trillion. This is nearly 2.5 times the gross national product of the entire world. In order to liquidate this debt, there is going to have to be enormous production, obviously, because the production is what liberates the income that goes to pay off the debt. So if all of the production of the world was applied to the paying of this debt, it couldn't pay off half of it in a year. And of course, even if it was so devoted, it wouldn't solve the problem, because all that production that people are making has its accompanying costs that are carried off into the future as well, and become even more debt against which paucity of future income is going to have to be applied. It is a never-ending process, and under current rules, one that the population of the world simply cannot escape. Economists have defined the purposes of economic activity in very unrealistic terms. The goals that economists prescribe are full employment and maximizing production. Are these realistic? You have to ask what society in its right mind would want to keep everyone working full-time, say 40 years in a row, 8 hours a day, regardless of its gains in efficiency. This is surely insanity. If you have an economic project, the goal ought to be to get it done as quickly as possible with as little bother to everyone concerned as possible. This, however, is inconsistent with the economist's goal of maintaining full employment. Major Douglas drew attention to the irony in the fact that if you look at the world of engineering, the people in it are applying their brains and their learning as best they can to get things done ever more efficiently, which means employing less and less human effort. At the same time, the economists and the politicians have an exactly opposite goal, this thing called full employment. which means that they are promising to keep people busy while the engineers are endeavoring to free them from the necessity of work. It is a dramatic instance of what is known these days as cognitive dissonance, where you are trying to reconcile two inconsistent, conflicting ideas in your mind. Because they cannot be reconciled, the mind collapses before the challenge and just can't deal with it. If you think about it, wouldn't, in fact, it be a magnificent achievement if in our economy we attained an unemployment rate of 90%? That is the orientation we should have, to maximize efficiency, to provide people with opportunity to do things other than work under instruction and under the controls of other people. People have always endeavored to make their lives more comfortable and to live with greater ease. In early times, it was common for the method of achieving this to be to raid a neighboring tribe in order to capture some persons in it and bring them back as your slaves. This led to the institution of virtual slave societies. There were large civilizations in which privileged elites were supported by large classes of slaves in a very organized fashion. It's not all that different from what we find happening in our contemporary society. For many of those in the well-heeled classes often speak of ordinary folk as if they have no reason to exist except to serve them. But besides what have not been inappropriately called wage slaves, who are human, there is another major component of the economy, a slave force exceeding in service and productive power anything even dreamt of by our forebears. These modern-day slaves are made of metal and plastic and run on fuel or electric power. Their productive capacity exceeds by thousands, in some cases millions of times, the capacities of the human flesh slaves whose lives in the past were spent or largely wasted in servile chores in order to permit a fortunate few to enjoy comforts and leisure. Our modern slaves have many advantages over the old-style ones. In the first place, the latter were hard to acquire. You might even lose your own life in a raiding party because candidates for slavery would fight hard to avoid being subjugated. Secondly, if you were a tribe, usually you could capture only a limited number of slaves from tribes nearby. It just wasn't practical to bring everybody back because you would end up with having more potential enemies among you than were practical to deal with. So until the industrial scale enslavement of the 17th and 18th centuries, typically not every ordinary tribe member could have their own slaves. Thirdly, if you wanted to have your slave services on a continuing basis, you could not avoid ongoing costs. For example, you had to feed and house them. Finally, even if human slaves could not go on strike and refuse to work, as modern workers, you might say wage slaves, do occasionally, once in a while they managed to revolt and escape or even massacre their owners. In this process, possibly reverse the positions in the slave-master relationship. By way of contrast, cybernetic slaves, which we would call industrial robots, are docile and predictable, doing exactly what they are programmed to do and never resisting the will of their masters. They will work day and night without grumbling. They never lay down tools or sabotage an assembly line in protest of their conditions. True, you have to power them with energy that will entail costs, just as you had to feed human slaves in the past, but once they are properly programmed and tuned, they seldom break down. They don't get ill physically or psychologically. Indeed, they are continually improvable. You have to pay for them once, but after that, they normally will provide many years of reliable service. And the most important thing about robotic slaves is that if you have enough money, you can have as many of them as you want, as you care to manufacture. Oddly enough, when you see references in the media to robots, there is often an attempt to instill fear. There are all sorts of predictions of robots becoming independent of our wills and taking over society. In fact, there's a very long tradition in the media of presenting robots in this fashion. It goes back at least to the 1920s with the film Metropolis. It was also represented in Stanley Kubrick's film Space Odyssey 2001. So this attempt to represent robots as a threat to society is very curious. A robot is, as I've said, essentially a slave. And a slave in robotic relationships is a device that is totally controlled out of another device. For example, if you have a printer that is connected to a computer, the computer is the controlling device and the printer is the slave. The printer never takes over the computer. And it's exactly the same situation with the robots that we have today. They are slaves of our will, and they pose no threat to us in the form of a revolt establishing the robots as the parties in power in society. The number of robots that are being used for industrial production today is exploding. For example, China in the year 2008 had approximately 30,000 industrial robots. By 2014, this number had grown to 200,000. It's projected that by the year 2018, there will be 600,000, a tripling of the number in only 4 years. There's no way that we can envisage the end of this process. The number of robotic slaves working to feed, clothe, house, embellish, educate, and recreate ourselves is going to grow exponentially into the future. This has tremendous implications for the imposition on humans of the necessity to work. And indeed, there have been some interesting predictions about what is going to happen in the near future. For example, a year or two ago, a study was made in Oxford University that predicted that within 10 to 20 years, 50% of all the jobs in advanced first world countries will be rendered redundant by the introduction of technology. Robots are going to perform the jobs that people have had imposed upon them through the program of full employment, a program that has been imposed on our societies by Fabian socialist theoreticians for the last 100 or so years. It's interesting that when Henry Ford introduced his more specialized assembly lines to produce his cars, he also vastly improved the conditions of work for his employees. Now, people have praised him for this, and they said he was exercising great foresight. But in fact, it turns out that he, in making his assembly lines more efficient, had created such boring and repetitive jobs that people just couldn't stand to do them for an extended period of time. So he had to give them enhanced incentives in order to keep them working for his company. These are the kinds of jobs that robots do expertly. And the introduction of robots just relieves people from the uncreative activities that have been imposed upon them in the past. So we should not fear the introduction on an increasing scale of robots, these modern day slaves in our society. In fact, we should be deeply grateful that they are there to serve the ends of extending our freedom and opportunities for a good life. Above all, we should be wary of the potential for Luddites, modern day Luddites, to appear, saying that disaster is upon us because people are being put out of work by these robots. It is all to the good, providing we can find a means of getting the productivity of the robots over to the members of the community. The answer to the problem that is posed by the displacement of human labor by these machines was provided to the world 100 years ago by a Scottish engineer named Major C.H. Douglas. He proposed that income should be made available to the population unconditionally, not in an uncontrolled fashion, but in a scientific fashion, actually related to the facts of production, and that in view of the enhanced productivity of our modern productive apparatus, this would be a continuously growing subsidy that all people could receive, and that would lead to a new form of society in which genuinely free people could have genuinely free relationships among each other. The promised benefits of robotization have simply not been delivered to the population. Indeed, our financial system as it exists has thwarted the transfer of those benefits. Instead of people having greater opportunity, greater security, they're faced with an increasingly precarious existence in which the old concept of the permanent lifetime job has gone out the window. Young people, if they're lucky, can get a contract. They can never count on having a sustained income that they can use to plan their lives, to get married, have children, acquire a house. It's obvious that the financial connection to this robotic development has to be examined and rectified. The costs of these robots are going to be incorporated in the prices that people are going to pay for goods in the future. But increasingly, people will have a shortage of means in order to pay for the costs of depreciation of the robots. And in order to overcome this problem, there's going to have to be a means of income supplementation. This was the problem that Douglas touched upon, no, thoroughly analyzed over 100 years ago and provided the solution to. The issue of freedom has been throughout Western civilization for many centuries a key subject for consideration and analysis. It is very important for people to have a clear concept of the essence of freedom. I submit that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. Because we live in an environment with limitations in which you will get some very bad feedback if you choose to do just whatever you want, you cannot logically adopt this as your standpoint. For example, if you choose to step off the roof of a 10-story building, you will get a quick lesson in the limitations of freedom. We live in a context of natural law, what the founder of social credit, Major C.H. Douglas, referred to as the canon. It is the underlying structure of the universe, and he believed that true freedom was our ability to explore that and to understand it. Similarly, if you wanted to poison yourself with drugs, you might be thinking yourself living a free existence, but shortly you risk having some very bad results from such a choice. So the freedom of people such as the Satanist Aleister Crowley, whose maxim that he has given to many of the youth of this world, which is, "Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," is not genuine freedom. It's just a form of insanity. Now, when you get into the theory of freedom, human freedom is most often associated with the domain of politics. For example, we are insistently told by press and politicians that our citizens who died in wars gave their lives so that we might preserve our precious right to vote for the government of our choice, and that this sacrifice they made has given us the essence of freedom. The standardized curricula of our educational system supports this line by inculcating in the young the belief that freedom is more or less synonymous with having a parliament or having a secret ballot to vote for that parliament. that periodically allows voters to get fed up with the political party in power, so-called in power. They're not as much in power as we are led to believe, I think. And we're periodically allowed to turf them out and import a different gang to run things. And while parliaments and votes may, if used judiciously by the electorate, be aids to freedom, they are far from being the essence of freedom. And in many respects nowadays, they have been warped in ways that actually result in diminishing our freedom. Freedom is a very simple thing. It is the ability of the individual to choose or refuse one thing at a time. This definition, which was supplied by Major Douglas, sheds light on the directly anti-freedom character of many of the aspects of our current political systems. The one thing at a time part of the definition is critical. Whenever a bunch of disparate policy options are bundled into one choice, for example, in the devious legislative device of the omnibus bill, where they combine many different policies and require legislators to vote on them simultaneously, in such a bill, freedom of choice is essentially extinguished. This also is why political party forms are so obnoxious. People are expected to express support all at once for a wide range of policies touching matters that are connected tenuously at most. This is why many voters feel uncomfortable with the process. In order to participate, they have to compromise their principles and wind up casting their ballot for what they see only as the least evil of the policy packages offered to them. Of course, this matters less now that once elected politicians typically no longer even feel an obligation to honor the commitments they've made during political campaigns. For example, in Canada, the country I come from, voters sick of such sleaziness have successfully pressured politicians to provide actual signed guarantees that they will keep campaign promises if they get elected. For example, guarantees not to increase taxes. People assumed that if they got it in writing, it could be made to stick. But in the end result, it didn't have any effect whatsoever. Taxes were raised as soon as the new government assumed office, which of course is the normal pattern because the politicians hope that the 4 years until the next election will give the electorate enough time to forget how they were betrayed. The emphasis on political choice as the basis of freedom disguises the fact that such choice is illusory unless economic freedom precedes it. A little thought should convince you that for the vast majority of people, the main limiting factor on their freedom throughout history has been economic rather than political. Only the odd person wound up in a dungeon for annoying a local office holder or powerful figure. Politics touches our lives irregularly, and one hopes normally infrequently, because when it touches, it often is not a pleasant experience. But economics, the requirement to meet our bodily needs, impinges upon us daily. And without such primary sustenance keeping us alive, our political vote is patently valueless. It is significant that choosing among economic options is more exemplary of freedom, as Douglas defined it, because normally such choices involve single, separate matters, things we can really identify with, rather than the mishmash of the unrelated or irrelevant ones we are typically offered in the political process. But the media and politicians are never eager to investigate the dimensions of our freedom measured by the progress being made in giving us more and ever more assured economic options. They try to keep our focus on the political question. We have come a long way in the extension of our economic options, but considering the exponentially rapid explosion of technology, nowhere nearly as far as we could have. When early man was naked and trying to catch a rabbit by running it down, he was investing much energy and time with poor economic results, often no lunch, whereas a man wielding A stick was more likely to bring his family a meal with less exertion. A man with a keen aim and a sling, or in this country, I suppose, the country I'm in at present, being Australia, a boomerang could bag dinner with even less effort. In other words, the invention of tools enhanced the efficiency of what men could achieve towards the satisfaction of their economic requirements. In those simple times, the reward was immediate, in the form of enhanced time to do other things of one's choosing. In other words, they had enhanced freedom. This is the natural consequence of improving one's equipment, and it was the motivation for innovating in this area. The progress we have made to the present is evidently enormous. We have vast resources of physical resources that we have revealed to be useful to us. We've applied machinery, technology to these to produce plethora, an amazing wealth of goods and services. And the result of this should be an enhancement of freedom commensurate with our economic progress. Yet if we look at our position relative to, say, the position of people living 50 years ago, when much of the technology we have today was unheard of, maybe even unimagined, our daily life has not changed significantly. Those people were working hours of work similar to what we have today. So the rewards of economic progress are not being got back to the population. And these rewards should be the foundation of a continual extension of our freedom. Social credit is the method whereby that potential can be got over to the population in the form of goods and services easily procured without the necessity, which we have today under our current financial system, of constantly expanding debt. The debt burden of the world apparently currently is about $152 trillion. Our gross world product is less than half of that figure. This is a limitation on our future freedom because that debt will have to be repaid. People are going to have to work in order to obtain revenue to repay it. And so, given the financial system we have, the more progress we make, just the further we fall behind in our ability to meet our financial obligations and the less freedom we have. Social credit is the key to rectifying this problem. Application of it is long overdue. Because of the censorship that has been imposed on discussion of social credit by the financial power going on 70 or 80 years now, not a large number of people have even heard the term. And among those who have, often they have associated it with some form of political activity, or even one of the various political parties that historically have borne the name social credit. These people will conceive of it as being analogous to conservatism or liberalism or socialism. That is, they think of it as a policy orientation or as an ideology. And it is true that Major Douglas himself defined social credit as a policy, as he said, the policy of a philosophy, pointing out that all policy springs from philosophy, inescapably. However, as Douglas implied elsewhere, this is only a partial understanding of the meaning of the term social credit. Social creditors, by whom I mean the people who promote understanding of social credit, certainly have an ideological orientation. But social credit itself is not an hypothesis or a theory, but rather a fact, a real phenomenon, an element within the logos or underlying structure of the universe. This will be more readily seen if we consider the basic meaning of the words involved. Social means pertaining to human beings in association, and credit means faith or belief. Thus, social credit in its most basic aspect means the belief people have that they can obtain what they want through association with others. This is not a theoretical phenomenon. It is real. It is something we have all experienced in thousands of ways in our lives. Your listening to this talk is an example of it. People in coming together do so in the expectation that it will bring some benefit to them, that it will give them something that they want. Thus, social credit is actually the basis of human association for the achievement of personal purposes and hence of personal satisfaction. It is, as I've said, a very real thing. The normal motivation for people to participate in voluntary activities like joining a sports club, or a book club, or a knitting circle, or to take a more dramatic example, even getting married. People simply would not come together in such ways if they didn't believe that thus getting involved with others brought them some kind of an advantage. Because social credit understood in this way is patently real, it is possible to study it analytically as a phenomenon of human existence, human experience. Anyone listening to this talk is actually associating with me. His or her belief, possibly limited at this time, that he or she might derive benefit from what I am saying is itself a specific example of social credit. A conscious social creditor is thus a person who studies social credit in its manifestations for the purpose of improving its quality and consistency. That is, a person who endeavors to maximize the validity of the belief that people can get what they want through association. Because human association is continual and infinitely variable, social credit is a work for a lifetime. Indeed, I suspect that it is what our lives, both materially and spiritually, are fundamentally about. Looking for the social credit in everything we do, besides being endlessly engaging and educational, enlivens our curiosity about all things and hence greatly enriches our lives. The social credit emphasis on the primordial importance of unadulterated belief of keeping a single, undistracted eye on our objectives, on getting what we want for mutual benefit, is supported by the teaching of Christ, who said, "All things are possible to he who believes," and "If two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven." Incidentally, the story of the campaign Major Douglas directed between the world wars, as chronicled in the contemporary publications of the British Social Credit Secretariat, provides a stirring example of the power of belief to achieve results against the most daunting odds. As this material has become available for all to read in recent times, thankfully to the good efforts of the Australian League of Rights website, it is well worth the effort of examination. Our associations occur in multiple levels of complexity, from simple friendship with another person to our connection to the whole of humanity. They are all distinct and potentially convey different sorts of profit to us. And we do have a connection with all of humanity, though not the one that those who would organize us into an amorphous, decultured mishmash by means of airy-fairy falsehoods backed up by uncompromising compulsion. Again, we know we have this universal connection because of the revelations of Christ, namely that we all have a common heavenly Father who loves us and whom we are enjoined to emulate, and that we are to love everyone else, even enemies, that there is no compulsion with God, and that the only way to enter his kingdom is by choice. If we follow Christ's example, as he enjoined us to do, we won't run out looking for people to impose our love on, but in our everyday dealings with others, we are to be honest and fair in the hope that our example will be catching, be infectious, and will become a governing idea for a never-increasing number of people. However, acting in this way is not always easy when governmental policies in virtually every country are working to a program of divide and rule, generating social friction by having us constantly stepping on each other's toes and thereby damaging our social credit, our belief that together, all together, we can achieve results that we deem desirable. In recent years, the very concept of belief has come under attack. Faith is ridiculed as an obsolete phenomenon, held only by foolish individuals. Yet it remains eternally true that faith, belief, underlies everything, good or bad, that people do. Indeed, nobody would even trouble to get up in the morning if they didn't believe that they had some reason to do so. Its potential for altering the course of society is why visionary faith, our social credit, has come under sustained attack in this time of relentless centralization of power in all areas, when the ability of individuals to choose or refuse one thing at a time without entailing dire implications for other aspects of their lives is subverted. Personally, I see the contemporary confusion about the importance of clarity and singleness of belief as being, in fact, the culmination of a very long-term and devious attack on human psychology and morale. The weakening of purpose resulting from contaminated belief used to be generally recognized and described by terms such as being conflicted or being in two minds about something. But a very useful modern term for it is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the simultaneous insinuation into the mind of two or more concepts that rational processes cannot reconcile. It is an attack on our undefended subconscious thinking. Without realizing what is happening to us, the incompatible ideas that our minds are called upon to embrace paralyze our power of reason. Cognitive dissonance now constitutes a key aspect of what Major Douglas described as the hypnotization of society. Once you become conscious of how the phenomenon affects you, and you become annoyed at being the target of a planned psychological attack, you can use your conscious mind to detect the cognitive dissonance in practically any sample of modern culture designed for mass consumption. It used to be relatively subtle, but now, after much application, its practitioners have become emboldened and are blatantly promoting such inanities as perpetual war being presented as the path to a more peaceful world, and the implementation of special rights for tiny minorities of questionable sanity even within the population, serving as pretexts for extinguishing the rights of the vast majority, and the patently forced and abrasive commingling of cultures. People are being virtually shaken by the throat out of their complacent stupor. The social credit of society as a whole, which originates in and operates only on individuals, has had immense harm done to it by these manipulative techniques. But now they are open for all to see who have some capacity for seeing, and the awakening has great potential for the revitalization of the faith that animates a successful society, by which I mean a society in which its members can achieve what they want, not what a coterie of bankers and social planners would have them be. I said at the outset that being real, social credit is something that can be studied and measured. What is the measure of social credit? I think it can be perceived as a ratio of all the things that the members of society want and actually achieve using the resources made available to them over all the things they aspire to achieve and could achieve if the artificial financial constraints on the availability to them of resources did not exist. The vast number of elements comprehended by such a ratio makes it impractical to calculate, but reflecting on it, on its evident smallness, will throw open a window into economic reality.